Hello and welcome to Carrier Compliance, how multi-carrier shipping solutions connect you to your carriers, an educational webcast session where we're going to help shippers discover how they can simplify the complexity of rating, labeling, tracking, and invoicing, no matter which carrier service you're going to be using. Now, my name is Michael Levins, and I'm Group Editorial Director for Peerless Media Supply Chain Group, which of course includes Logistyx Management and Supply Chain Management Review magazines, and I'll be your moderator for this session that's being brought to you by Logistyx. Well, we've all been conditioned at this point to expect same-day, next-day delivery, and anyone in the retail space is well aware free shipping is no longer the exception. Of course, it's the norm. Now, we want what we want when we want it, and we want what we want and when we want it. And if you can't do it, then the consumer and that customer is going to quickly bolt off and find someone who can do that. We've all had that experience so far. So as we continue to report in Logistyx Management, the mounting pressure to deliver increasingly better service at a lower and lower cost finds many shippers contracting with several carriers to make this happen. A lot of us are feeling that these days. Unfortunately, leveraging a vast carrier network can introduce a new set of challenges. For example, shipping teams are often negotiating on multiple carrier technologies with multiple definitions of carrier compliance to get shipments out the door. So how can this be streamlined, and how can shippers achieve carrier compliance in global multi-carrier shipping environment? How are we going to make this happen? Well, that question today is going to be answered by Ken Fleming, and Ken is president of Logistyx, and he's going to set out to help us get to the bottom of this. Now, Ken is going to explain why shipments are most often out of compliance and how this impacts your bottom line. He's also going to identify the challenges of cross-border parcel shipping and review best practices for overcoming those challenges. And then he's also going to help shippers better understand how you can simplify the complexity of rating, labeling, tracking, and invoicing, no matter which carrier service organization your operation is currently using. Now, just a quick note before Ken gets us started today, we are going to have time for a question and answer session when Ken's done with his presentation. So please make sure to submit your questions at any time while Ken's going through his slide deck today. We're going to get to as many as we can with Ken on the line today, but if we're not able to get to your question today, and we're probably going to have quite a few of them, we'll move those over to Ken, and he'll be certainly able to get back to you via email. So Ken, without any further ado, the podium is yours.
Michael, thank you so much. It's great to be back and speaking with you and the audience again. Well, as you've highlighted here, what we're going to get a chance to speak about today is the whole area of carrier compliance and carrier connectivity. I think in one of our previous webinars that we did, we spoke about transportation management, and I think one of the questions from the audience back then, if my memory is spot on here, I think was with respect to what do we find as being the one key difference between a transportation management software solution and multi-carrier shipping solutions, and I had responded that it was carrier compliance, and we had such a great response to that question. It was like, could I spend some more time in explaining carrier compliance, which really led us to the opportunity and trying to have the conversation that we're doing today. So let me try to, before we get into the actual specifics around carrier compliance and working with carriers from a shipping solution perspective, let me try to set the context for everyone that's listening today. And to do so, I'm doing a real mini recap with respect to, okay, the industry, what we're seeing, the types of solutions that are available, and then where companies are focusing and what they should look to. And I'll do a very short summary of that before we dive right into the whole aspect of what we've highlighted on the carrier side of things. So here we go. All right. So first is that I hopefully, everybody that's joining this call, that I really don't have to explain this. But the number of times I actually lead into different presentations that I've done or conversations that I've had with people, I often ask them is that, what is their strategy around parcel management? What are they trying to do? Do they even have a strategy? And we should be understanding why, right? So you hit on several factors in the introduction today, but if I look at it, we all as consumers recognize that what we're doing within the market is increasing the amount of parcels that are actually coming to our home or our offices. If I look at my own situation, or if I said a year ago how many parcels were coming to my house versus what they are this year, or even to our office when I take a look at parcels being delivered that are to people at work, but for personal delivery options rather than actual work product coming in the door, that alone shows me what's actually happening in the industry. And if I reflect to everybody that's listening to us today is to say, just take a look at what you see yourself doing, and then recognizing that's exactly what's going on in the entire market. That's what we're responding to. So it doesn't really matter, I say, which statistics we look at. What we're really talking about is this industry, and parcel in particular, as a transport modality, is growing faster than any other modality in what we need to manage with respect to being, whether you're the logistics or the supply chain officers of your business, of what you need to manage. So if this is the fastest growing for you, how can you be doing that without having a strategy to do that? Last week I was presenting at another event where I was speaking to, there were 200 companies in the room. And when I spoke to those companies at the end of it, we were asking questions like we do in this session. And as a part of it, I said, well, I've got a question for everybody that's out there. And my question to them was, how many of you actually have strategies to address the change in the industry and what's happening for parcel within your business? And of the 200 so companies that were there, 2 hands went up. And immediately I thought, oh, I might be presenting at the wrong place if 198 companies don't have strategies on parcels. So my immediate follow-up question was, how many companies in the audience aren't focused at all on parcel? And only 1 was. So what it told me immediately, just with two quick questions before we went into our full-blown Q&A, is 197 companies that were in the room that day had no strategies with respect to how and what they're doing with parcel. And that means today they're still reacting to specific requirements versus planning for their future and the growth that's inevitable within their industry. So let's take a quick look at some of the concepts that we've spoken about in the past, and then we'll transition directly into carrier compliance, carrier connectivity, and what options companies have today. So first is TMS, Transportation Management Solutions, and types and positioning. And I think this is important. We borrowed this storyline from our friends at Gartner when it comes down to the different types of systems that are out there. And too often, we meet with companies that believe that they've chosen a transportation management software solution and therefore it handles parcel and everything they're trying to do with parcel. And when Gartner reports on this, they create the Magic Quadrant report specific to what they refer to as multimodal domestic capabilities designed for a shipper or a third-party logistics provider. But what they don't do is actually highlight and specify the unique differences that occur in the area that we're going to talk about today, which is the area that I've circled here on the screen that you're looking at is that parcel management space. Now, Gartner, for example, have uniquely created a report on multi-carrier shipping software, which is what they specify in this segment, or TMS for parcel. But I encourage the listeners that are looking for these capabilities to look beyond research reports such as the Magic Quadrant and take a look at the specific reports around parcel management, because you will find it very, very helpful in helping you make the right decisions with respect to the solutions and strategies you have to address parcel shipping. So what do we mean when we take a look at this? Well, one of the things that we did in ourselves working with Gartner Group is to analyze the difference in the 2 types of solutions. So on the left-hand side, you see the definition of transportation management and the types of modalities it serves. Now, this is directly from Gartner. So what they say is a company that's evaluating and using the Magic Quadrant to select a TMS solution typically has shipping volumes based on the following. So 70% of what they plan and ship is FTL and LTL. Parcel, ocean, and other make up an equal 10%. Now, this is typical. And if we were talking about the parcel side of things, a typical company that's looking to address multi-carrier shipping or transportation management execution would look very, very different, where 60 to 70% of their transactional volume is parcel related, 20% on FTL, LTL, likely and maybe from parcel consolidation, and then 10 and 5% attached to ocean or other. Now, while these can say that they're typical, what I recommend every company does is that they should evaluate where they are within their business and understanding the differences between the two, because we firmly believe that no one solution does it all, and that companies have to evaluate based on their distribution centers, the types of products, ship from store, global footprints, multiple factors that will lead to help them determine the kind of solution that they're looking for. And they would find is that after they do that evaluation, it's not going to be left or right, but it's actually going to be probably a more balanced approach, that 50% of their volume is likely parcel. A lot of their high cost shipments will come from other modalities, but that can vary by distribution center, location, geographic footprint, et cetera. So take the time to evaluate what kinds of systems are right for you, and then based on those systems, you choose the type of technology that best fits those needs. And that leads us into the focus on parcel that recaps the point that I made one of the last meetings that we had, which is multi-carrier compliance and being compliant with a carrier is if I have to pick one key differentiator between both TMS and multi-carrier shipping or TME. Now, to highlight comments made from the Ohio State University's research on this is that TMS and parcel management are essential. Costs are a large component of the total supply chain, but if you look at this, their recommendation here is any company that is going to remain competitive should be looking at both of these systems, not one or the other, but both. And I find too often than not, companies look at it and say, oh, I've got a TMS, I know what I'm doing, and yet you ask them if they've got a parcel strategy, and they don't. So that's what we kind of focus on today is understand that once you set this strategy, what does it mean to be carrier compliant? What kinds of capabilities do you need, and what's the impact to your decision as a result? So let's have a closer look. Carrier compliance. Well, now I'm going to shock, maybe I'll shock some people today or not, if we actually take a look at what would happen if your organization had to connect to a group of carriers to provide access to you to distribute your goods worldwide. Now, I've got a diagram to kind of demonstrate the point that I'd like to make today, and I'm going to come back to it near the end. But let's have a closer look at a carrier network. Now, at the bottom, when we talk about customers here, this is like organizations such as yours that are shippers on the phone right now, whether they're retailers, manufacturers, 3PLs, that are required to get their products to market. And to do so, their technology, their capability has to access this group of carriers up on the top. And those carriers could be specific to APAC, North America, South America, Europe, Middle East, Africa type markets, where these carriers are unique within each of these regions. Now, even though we recognize some of these brands as being global providers in each of these regions, I can attest to you right now that there is no such thing as a single carrier that has global connectivity. The big ones even act unique in each of these markets, and that ties to what they provide as far as local services, whether it's in language, connectivity, or services that they provide in each of those markets are unique. We also have the effect of companies that have to deal with freight brokers or companies that are dealing with specific or specialty service providers that might just do rate shopping or rate type services for other types of carriers. And so this network, as you can see, becomes a large mess of spaghetti in the middle with respect to how any company would have to build this connectivity if they were going to try to do it on their own. So what kinds of options are available out there for organizations to be able to do that? Well, before we get to that point, let's take a look at what does that actual spaghetti really mean? Is it just a connection to a carrier? No, it's much, much more. Okay. So if I start, let's take a look at shipment execution for a moment. And if I really do this at a very high level, right, the optimal shipments are typically rated before packing, right? So how much is it going to cost me to ship this from A to B? And determining the type of shipment, whether it's one pallet, 3 boxes, 1 box, all could impact that. The carrier rate shopping, which service am I going to use and from which carrier? What will the actual shipping cost be? It needs to trigger the documentation necessary to accompany the shipment, whether it's a standard shipment, whether it contains specific types of goods that would need to pass the hazmat test, such as a lithium battery, whether there are specific types of goods that require specialty labels to be produced in order to be shipped within a specific carrier, and then the manifesting information that occurs at the end of day pickup and in communications with the carriers that automate the information and materials that go from their systems to a customer's back-end systems. All those things have to take place whenever we're dealing with one carrier and one service. But what happens when we have to deal with it within that diagram that we just highlighted? The situation becomes much more complex. Let's move on and take a look at what happens. Well, when I say service, what did I mean when I said service? Which service? I mean, same day is same day, right? I mean, if we think about that, well, that's not necessarily the case. If I go, back several years ago, we in the industry would turn around and say, I need to get it there same day. And I could potentially get same day delivery from UPS and FedEx, and it would be pretty simple. I'd pick one of them, I'd say I need it there the same day, and that would happen. Well, now what we find is that each of those companies provide different types of same-day service. So same day is no longer just same day. I've given 3 examples here where I could be doing FedEx first overnight or UPS next day air early, FedEx priority overnight or UPS next day air, FedEx standard overnight or UPS next day air again. Now, what happens when we do that then is, how do I know which one to choose? And are there differences in costs? Are there differences in delivery levels? What is my lead time to get my goods to my customer? Because ultimately, I need to know the origin, destination. I need to know when it needs to be there. I want to be able to choose a high quality service in the end that ensures that I'm going to satisfy my customer's delivery requirements. But as Michael pointed out at the introduction here, I want to do it at the lowest possible cost in order to compete for this same day delivery service for free. And so how do I do that when I've got so many choices? And if these choices are replicated, for example, across all those different carriers we just showed you worldwide, you get to understand the level of complexity that you yourself are going to manage unless you've chosen a technology to help you do that. Well, is that the only factor? No, it's not. And there are more. So for example, when we look at what we refer to as a rating engine or rating, which basically I would describe it as parcel optimization, that when you're taking a look at any shipment and you say, I want to be able to provide priority service to my priority customers. I want to be able to provide weekend delivery to a specific customer segment. I need to provide the capability to do cross-border shipments for this client and or this client. There are different business rules that are set up with respect to how to process, what to do based on different business conditions. And this is another factor that must be applied to what has to happen to determine how to communicate with the carrier, what information is shared with the carrier, what compliance factors that you have to do to work with that carrier that have to be determined times the number of carriers that you're working with. So to do so, you require the business rules engine, if you like, or the ability to optimize what you're trying to do within that large network, right? Because not always choosing the same carrier over and over again is going to give you the same service level at the same price or best price. Next, we take a look with what happens within the label. Now, this is where we kind of think of how simple can it get. And I often sit there and say, if I'm just, somebody says to me, that whole elevator speech of, what is it that your company does? Or if my kids say to me, Dad, what does your company do? I always boil it down to, the labels that are on the box, right? And if you look at it, it's way more than the label, as I've already described. But label compliance is another requirement that's specific to every carrier. So whether we're communicating with those carriers via web services, so some of them offer a web service to communicate to get the label back. Some of them have the ability to take on-premise where the label is generated directly from within the application. It can be label customization, can be impacted by business rule, by brand, where you might want to have your branding implemented within the label, or in some cases not. You want your brand hidden within the label based on the value of goods that are inside that box. Whether you're dealing with returns processing or returns labels, so there are multiple requirements that can happen by label, by shipment type, by business rule, and then by carrier and by carrier region. So you start to get that multiplier effect that actually can make our clients' world very, very crazy, because every carrier wants you to be compliant with their label. Why? Because label compliance for them is what allows their automated systems to work and be very efficient. Every time that you don't comply with generating the label that their systems match up to, that means that they have to move towards manual processing. And manual processing for them costs money. And if it costs them money, it's going to cost you money as a part of that shipment. So getting it right and getting it compliant is designed to do everything correct from the get-go. When I talked earlier, I said one of the other factors is business rules, right? So how do I know what carrier to select, right? If I'm going to deliver on a weekend, do all the carriers that I contract with do Saturday and Sunday deliveries? Maybe several do Saturday, but only a few do Sunday. Maybe some of them are doing different types of services as to who could provide overnight versus not. So whenever you're selecting the type of service based on lead time, you want to be able to do that shop, if you like, within the specific carriers that match the business rules or business requirements you have for that shipment. So when you do that, that refines the selection criteria. It changes the capabilities that your system is going to be looking for, and therefore changes the compliance that has to happen on the back end. So to generate custom and compliant shipping labels, you need to apply the business rules, the rate shopping together with the combination of carriers for it to generate the correct results for you. Now, hopefully, Ken, that's it. But the answer is no, because we've only discussed the label and the requirements of communicating with the carriers, but we've also got the documentation that has to go with the products and services as we distribute them. So you look towards having carrier compliant documentation in an automated way specific to the market, or specific to, in Europe, you would deal with the CMR document that must accompany all shipments of goods. But documentation requirements vary based on type of shipment, whether you're dealing domestic shipments, international shipments, or the actual type of good, whether it's a hazmat requirement or not a hazmat requirement. Each of those capabilities mean that different documents have to be produced for different types of transactions, and each of those has to be compliant with the carrier for the carrier to be able to pick those up and deliver them on your behalf. So when we look at that complexity and you start that multiplying effect, you now see why I said if there's one key differentiator between transportation management solutions and transportation management execution, carrier compliance and carrier connectivity is key and number one to ensure that you're going to be able to meet the requirements of what's happening to you as your market grows. Under shipment execution, it doesn't just stop where we are. Now we've got the product ready to go, but once it's ready to go, now what happens? I'm now receiving tracking event information, and that's coming from every carrier I use, whether they're in Asia Pacific, North America, South America, Europe, and they're going to give us that information in multiple formats. How do I handle those? Events, I call it consolidation. What happens if I'm receiving information? Do I react to it? Is it late? If it's late, what do I do? If I'm measuring the KPIs of a carrier, do I measure them equally? How many got on time in full? How do I measure that based on the carrier's reports and my own reports? That's the type of information that has to be standardized for you to be able to review it so that you're not interpreting a single carrier's information that they're sharing with you in their way, but you're viewing it in your way. Think of it as if you were to receive, for example, your mobile phone bill from multiple phone carriers, would they all be the same? Could you interpret them the same? How much do you get for free within a month? What's the cost per connection? Do you get text free, not free? Every one of those examples makes it very confusing to be able to evaluate and compare carriers on a performance basis based on different information. So to be able to normalize that data is key as you scale to address your carrier network. So what do I really mean by that? Well, let's take a closer look. For carrier data to come to you, it comes in multiple data formats. And the first generation that we see companies do this with is it comes in fragmented, meaning it's not unified. You can get track and trace data, for example, but typically you need to go to that carrier's website to be able to find out what's going on. So in each case, it's unique. Or you're utilizing that carrier's own application and you're receiving the data within that application back. So it's coming in their formatted way, and not a way that allows you to interpret it. So for example, do you understand the differences in messaging types between what UPS is telling you is a late shipment and FedEx is telling you is a late shipment? And are they the same message numbers with respect to how you integrate that into your applications? The second is when you can consolidate that information, which is rather than going out to the carrier's site, that you go to the carrier's site, but you pull the data down. And in that case, the data is now sitting with you, but again, it's unique in format. The third, as you can imagine, is you now normalize that data. So what do we mean is that you build your standards and you say a late shipment for me in my business application is known as error code, say 123, and you're going to convert the carrier's late shipment messages into a format that you understand so that you're not changing all your back-end systems in order to be compliant with that particular carrier's messaging formats. That way, when the carrier's applications change, you don't have to change your piece on your end. It's only one half of the picture that needs to be solved. And the last, when we talk about fourth generation, is driving that into a more proactive manner. Taking that track and trace information that's been normalized and looking for exceptions within the information and allowing you to react to it so that you're dealing with exceptions rather than trying to manage that whole network we described a moment ago, right? So what happens, therefore, if you sit there and say, well, what are we really trying to say when you pull all these requirements and capabilities and complexities together? Let's take a quick look. There's that picture of the carrier network again, and what we refer to as the network challenge. Without a solution in the middle that actually deals with not just the connectivity to the carriers that we're talking to, but allows you to convert your data formats into theirs, which can come in multiple formats and multiple ways to meet with their requirements on label processing, and then deal with the data distribution to them and do it within your own security requirements and their security requirements, is not an easy thing for anyone to implement. So that is really, when we talk about carrier compliance being the #1 factor of what a multi-carrier shipping solution does, is remove the headache so that you're doing a mapping from your business applications to one solution, and then that one solution is doing a one-to-many integration with all the carriers that you work with within your world. So what options do companies have if they're looking towards a solution to do that? And I'm going to describe 4 for you. Okay. 1, direct from the carriers. 2, is it built into your warehouse management system already? 3 is, I have a TMS. Can I do it with a TMS? And 4 is the multi-carrier shipping solution as an option. So let's take a quick look at these 4. So first, we talk about direct from a carrier. This is the one that we see that most companies are using. And in a lot of companies who start to look at multi-carrier shipping solutions, when we talk to them, they typically have a solution from each of the carriers they utilize, and they're sitting side by side, or their IT team is manually building the integration between each of those applications. And when the carrier changes the app, their IT team has to correspond with updating the integration that was completed. So staying compliant with a carrier that changes their business rules, that changes their services available, that changes the label requirements, can be very tedious when you're dealing with these integrations direct from a carrier-based solution. typically, for the U.S. market, these changes occur annually and typically happen during the peak season, right at the end of the peak season, so that all new rates and all new services are provided at the beginning of the calendar year. Outside the U.S. domestic market, these rate changes, the label compliance and updates occur regularly. And what do I mean by regularly? Every day, every week of every month, the international carriers that we work with are constantly changing and upgrading their services that they offer in each of the markets that they work in. And that's the cost of carrier compliance, is that without a solution that actually removes that for you, you have to manage that yourselves. The second is, but it's built in, it's built or build it into my WMS solution, my warehouse management solution. Now, there are some WMS solutions that have the ability to process parcel, but for them to do that, either they have what I call basic capabilities already existing within the WMS solution, or you have to build the carrier compliance component on the back end of what's produced. So can it produce a label? Yes, but is that label compliant with a particular carrier to be able to send it? And the answer is it may be or it may be not. Now, let me give you a story in our life of a logistics company that's based in the United States that was using label production directly out of their warehouse management system. And for a particular carrier, they were using that carrier to pick up and deliver from 3 warehouses, one on the East Coast, one in the mid-market, and then a third on the West Coast of the U.S. And in each of those areas, they had integrated the exact same application to the exact same carrier and produced a label that was compliant to the carrier specifications. The carrier investigated that label compliance to validate that the customer had produced the correct label and validated that it was correct for their Eastern warehouse. For their Midwestern warehouse, it failed, and for their Western warehouse, it failed, even though the label generated was identical to the specifications. So how is it possible to pass in one and fail in the other 2 warehouses? And the answer was very simple, that the carrier service agent in that region interpreted the data coming off those labels differently and therefore certified or did not certify uniquely each of those sites. When you utilize a certified solution, you bypass the need for that process to occur. So again, you're not having to do the map and the process of doing it. The solution actually does that for you. The third is the TMS solution. And I started early by trying to set the framework for our talk here this afternoon, in that a TMS system can be interpreted as handling all modalities. Well, there are some capabilities, for example, that are unique to parcel that don't exist in a TMS system. And there's other capabilities that are unique to TMS that do not exist in the parcel system. So on the TMS side of things that are unique, for example, is load optimization or route planning. Why? Well, if you're loading a truck, a full truckload, and you've got a planned distribution of dropping it off to various customers or various warehouses, you want to define and plan the route necessary to achieve the optimum cost distribution of distributing those goods in a timely manner that matches what the customer's expectivity is of their delivery windows. So when you marry those things together, a TMS system will plan that route optimization. A TMS system will help you identify how best to load the truck so that your first delivery comes off first, second delivery second, etc. And those types of algorithms and capabilities of managing the distribution of goods across different modalities and multimodal, intermodal type transactions is what a TMS system is designed to do. But can you do the same for parcel? Meaning, can I fill up a truck and dictate which way the carrier is going to drive? And the answer is no. Quite simply, carriers plan their own routes. Why? Because they're optimizing based on their network, based on all their customers. And their commitment to you is based on the type of service. So you don't care how they load the truck as long as they're meeting same-day delivery. You don't care how they load the truck if you've got 2-day overnight and it arrives by 2-day. So those types of capabilities differ. So when you look at where the TMS changes things, it's not focused on the execution piece of rating and selecting the carriers and compliant. It's focused much more on the front-end processes around planning. And the systems are designed to act differently. Now, does it mean that it couldn't do it? No, it could. But if it does it, again, it means that you are having to extend those capabilities and manage some of those processes yourself to overcome the inefficiencies in the TMS application. The last is in the multi-carrier shipping solution, and it was designed to cover everything that we've highlighted today. So that's what its purpose is. So you have multiple choices here to make, but how do you choose which one is right for you, and how do you choose when and how to use 1, 2, or even 3 of these options? And it's going to lead me into kind of my closing comments for today's discussion. So let me position this by saying this market is segmented in 4 types of strategies that I'd like to highlight for you. So first is what we refer to a level 1 type requirements in the lower left-hand side of the slide that you're looking at. And it contains the capabilities of what I would refer to as basic shipping requirements. So I need to ship my goods domestically. I need to access the big 3, such as UPS, FedEx, and USPS. And I want to be able to do track and trace information, but that's good enough. I don't need anything fancy. I just got to deliver my goods within that particular description. So typically that's used between that is, low volume type shippers, so they're not doing high volume, but they're also low complexity, meaning they're not looking for very many advanced capabilities attached to that. So that's one space. The level 2 is the company that's trying to take that same capability, but now I have to do it into other markets, whether it's move my goods cross-border, such as US to Canada, whether it's moving my goods from across Europe, or with the impact of Brexit, if I'm sending them to and from the UK, how will that change my shipping requirements? That's the capability of a level 2. Still basic shipping, generating labels, being compliant with carriers, but those carriers are very regionalized and localized with respect to how you have to work with them. A level 3 type requirement in the lower right-hand side is where you're extending those capabilities. You're looking at doing invoice reconciliation. So you pull the invoice in from the carrier so that you can match the carrier's invoices to what you've actually shipped and audit those with respect to finding shipments that are out of sync with respect to what you're being asked to be paid. Maybe they're being invoiced for the same way bill twice, which quite often happens. Or maybe you find that you're overpaying for a service that did not get delivered in the same day when you ordered same day delivery. How do you manage these transactions and invoices if you cannot marry the information together? So that's an example of applying business intelligence or extending the functionality as a level 3 type solution would be. And the last one of a level 4 is one that's really taking a strategy of global distribution, servicing customers and markets worldwide, and trying to manage those carriers and distribution of their goods on a global basis. Why is that becoming more and more important? It's just the aspect of e-commerce. More and more, we're ordering products from companies that reside in one market, and we're living in other markets where we're saying, deliver my goods from US to Europe, or Europe to the United States, where the consumer is buying online from any market anywhere in the world. And as that happens, we're looking to be able to have visibility into global inventories, global shipments, global services, global carriers, local regional carriers, down to those carriers that can deliver same-day delivery in specific markets, whether it's London, New York, or Seoul, for example. So the complexity of these types of solutions can vary. What's even more difficult to understand is that companies don't reside necessarily in one level of the other or the other. You, as a part of the evaluation, you might take into consideration is, where do I sit, for example, in the US market? Am I more level 1 today? In Europe, am I level 2? Am I level 3 maybe in Canada or in Asia Pacific? But you'll find that if you evaluate yourself, you may start in one location or another. And I would emphasize that by saying, take a look at what you see here. Evaluate where you start today. And here I'm saying, I might be starting in a level 1 type solution where I'm looking for basics. But I've made a decision that I'm looking to get to the level 4 market. And what I need to evaluate is, how am I going to go from level 1 to a level 4 type solution strategy? In which case, you're looking at the path may lead you through the level 2, where you're adding carriers and countries, the level 3, where you're adding capabilities and visibility, or maybe you're combining both. But for a company to make a decision on how to address this, in my view, you must evaluate what kinds of solutions are available, understand the complexity of carrier compliance and the importance in selecting the solution, understand where you are today and the capabilities you have to choose from to decide what's the best solution for you to implement, and then based on that, choose the right technology with the right level of services and carrier compliance to be able to address your needs. And with that, I thank you for listening to me, and I'm going to hand you back to Michael, who I'm sure is going to help me address the questions that I already see coming in. Michael, back to you.
Absolutely. Oh, Ken, great job today, sir. Just a wonderful job of walking us through the presentation today. And we do have a number of questions that are rolling in. We do have some time for a Q&A right now. And again, as I mentioned at the outset, if we do not get to your question today, we'll be packaging all of these up and moving them over to Ken, so he'll be able to answer your question via email. Ken, the first question I have, I think it was something that I might pose a question to you, and I really liked what you brought up earlier on in the presentation when you mentioned that you recently were doing a live presentation and or face-to-face presentation. You asked how many companies out there have experience with parcel management strategies, and you said you were surprised by how few did. Why do you think this is in 2019, where shippers are more reacting and not necessarily planning? Why do you think that is?
It's a great question, Michael, and I would tell you, I think in at least in my opinion and view, I think there's two major factors to it. First is that this industry is incredibly complex. I mean, you could see that in that diagram that we started off earlier with respect to the Gartner Group when they evaluated the types of TMSs versus the types of shipping strategies and modalities that are out there. So what's really happening is, in my view, is that companies are very confused with respect to what's the type of solution. We see that companies select solutions to address the problem and then find out that it didn't quite address it. In many cases, that's the situation with respect to a TMS. I don't need to do parcel because I bought a TMS and that's going to help me do it. And then they find later that that's not true. And I think that, my hat's off to Gartner and other groups that are actually now out there educating organizations to be more aware of the capability differences between parcel and TMS. So the first is, I think that the market is still confused with respect to it. The second is that I think that in talking to companies, parcel seems to be an afterthought. And it seems strange in nowadays with the amount of parcels that we're doing, right, is that, organizations implement the WMS, they implement maybe, if I look at it, more often than not, for example, the companies that we work with, at least 85, 90% are integrated directly into warehouse management systems. So they turn and they view that my warehouse management system handles the parcels are therefore active, but oops, look at the complexity of the carrier network. So parcels gets attached to a warehouse management process, but it's not clear with respect to how many carriers are going to work with, where I'm going to work with them, and then how am I going to manage them? And that's what companies seem to be ill-prepared for. So when I talk about parcel strategy, it's really about looking at it from this perspective that we've spoken about today, is don't let it be an afterthought. It's got to start much earlier in the process based on the strategies that companies should be taking to address the growth in parcel that they're seeing. So those are probably the two biggest ones.
Yep, that's terrific. Yeah, and the growth numbers you shared with us, and I mean, not only are those facts right there in front of us, but also we're all feeling it, as you mentioned too. We're feeling it in our personal lives. We're seeing it in our personal lives. We're seeing it in our business lives. A few more questions here, Ken. Well, we still have some time to squeeze a few questions in here. Question to Ken. Ken, what do you say is the most common solution that your company tends to replace? So I guess when logistics comes in, what are you replacing typically is what this gentleman is asking.
Another great question. More often than not, it is what I call the homegrown approach. So
Sure.
companies have integrated to a single carrier solution, but not that they're using a single carrier. They've integrated to a single carrier solution more than once. So, carrier one, carrier two, carrier three, for example. And then they're doing that, for example, in the United States, and then they're doing the same thing in Germany, and they're doing the same thing in France. And when you start multiplying that, that means that the dependency on their IT team to remain compliant and update those systems on an annual basis to keep pace with carrier changes starts becoming exponential. And as companies are being impacted now with reduced IT organizations due to whether or not, they've got cloud hosting strategies and priorities for IT resources become more and more in demand, right? They're actually saying, we can no longer maintain these things. And so that's the number one thing that we see that drives them to say, okay, now it's time for me to look to multi-carrier shipping. By far, number one, replace the homegrown in-house solution.
Yeah, so that just continues to multiply and multiply. Next thing you know, you have 7, 8, 10 different individual carriers that you've tried to piece together, and now you have zero visibility, and it's all over the shop. So
exactly.
Kind of a couple more questions here too, as we we start to wrap up a little bit. And again, we do have a number of questions rolling in, so please, thank you for those. Keep those coming. We're going to get to as many as we can today, and move the rest over to Ken. And again, he'll get back to you via email. So, a question for Ken. Ken, as far as benefits go, what issues have your users of companies overcome through using parcel shipping solutions? So, what would you say are some of the biggest benefits your clients are seeing?
So by far, Michael, number one is you actually will reduce your cost. And I know that that seems that, the number of companies we talk to and say, oh, we already do that, or we've done that, or we've implemented this, or we're pretty smart, we've been doing it for years. We hear those statements all the time. But just the concept of being able to look to multiple carriers to be able to define, which one could service me better, how well are they performing, what's happening within, a particular relationship with one or the other. We're seeing great savings. I mean, in general, a company that's moving from a single source solution to a multi-source solution through multi-carrier shipping, you can look to up to 30% savings right off the bat. And that's because you're now shopping. You're now saying, okay, wait a minute, what options do I have? Am I choosing the right vendor? The number of times we see companies that say, I'm defaulting to a 2-day overnight service because I think that's the best for that service, but don't measure the lead time to recognize that same-day delivery via ground will still get it there guaranteed at a lower price. Those types of activities are the things that usually companies think they're doing well, but they don't realize because they don't have the capability to truly see their own data. Those two, we trip across those ones all the time.
Makes sense.
Another one would be around the audit area that I was talking about earlier, is that are you really getting what you paid for? So you asked for it to be shipped overnight, but did you know it got there? And if you did know it got there or not, did you get billed accordingly for it? And are you reconciling those things to ensure you're not overpaying for a particular service that did not make it? That's another area where a system like we're talking about right now would drive benefits to a client.
Right, outstanding. And we do have time for one more quick question here, and I thought this was an interesting question. Hey, Ken, can I just do EDI and accomplish the same thing? I thought that was an interesting question. So, I'm going to age myself now to say that, I was around when, EDI was still really, really doing well, right? But here's my phrase that I think everybody will recognize. EDI will never die. Right. It's got its role and purpose, and frankly, we use it in order to be able to communicate with a lot of the carriers that have only got ADI capabilities. So, some carriers do EDI, some carriers have API capabilities, some don't. They have web services where you're communicating with their back-end solution services. Others don't at all. And, depending on small regional carriers, you might be just doing things via email or flat file transmissions. But every carrier's capability changes. So could it be done with EDI? The answer is yes. But two key things to remember about EDI in this context. One is,
you're still managing and maintaining it. If a carrier makes a change to their platform or formats or data content, you have to update your side. If the carriers don't support it, then you've got to do something different. So what I think is that the core concept behind EDI is still alive and well, but with the advent of new technologies, whether it's using the internet, not the internet, APIs, XML messaging, direct to carrier, indirect to carrier. There are so many options in that that spaghetti map I showed earlier that that's the thing you're really trying to avoid. And so the answer is yes, but.
Right. That's a very good answer. Well, Ken Fleming, President Logistyx, sir, I want to thank you today for just a terrific job putting all this in context for us today and giving us a lot to think about. There's no question about that. So thank you. And I want to also thank everybody for attending today. And again, we do have a number of questions rolling in. We are up against the clock, so we're going to move the rest of those questions over to Ken, and he'll be able to get back to you via email. Ken Fleming, thanks again, sir. Wonderful job today.
Michael, thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you, and I want to thank everybody for attending. Have a great day.